Welcome to the third episode in a Legendarium series about the Little Ice Age. In Part 3, The Russian Apocalypse, we will talk about how a time of widespread hardship and suffering led to the fall of a Tsar in Russia, followed by almost a generation of civil war and foreign invasion, called the Time of Troubles. In the year 1600, a volcanic eruption in South America led to a dramatic worsening of the Little Ice Age, which in turn led to even lower crop yields. By the 1600s, many people were forever on the verge of destitution, if not starvation, as they endured one disaster after another. In 1642, Massachusetts Bay froze up completely. The next year, floods in the Netherlands became so severe that the waters left chickens and pigs in trees. These disasters had a cascading effect, as sick and malnourished farm workers did less work. This in turn caused crop yields to drop even further and thus food prices to rise. Even those still able to make ends meet had far less money to spend, which took a toll on craftsmen and merchants. Some of the desperate people turned to crime, but many others postponed marriage, had fewer children, or even abandoned their sons and daughters in the woods. The most desperate escaped hunger by killing themselves. No country endured more than Russia. For 14 years, the son of Ivan the Terrible, Tsar Fyodor, ruled in name only. He was an extraordinarily weak-minded young man who likely suffered from what we would today call a developmental disability. During his reign, a semi-literate Tartar named Boris Godunov won the support of the lower nobility and made himself de facto Tsar of Russia. He even married his sister to Tsar Fyodor and used this royal connection to thwart the efforts of the old boyars to reclaim power. However, Boris had two things in between him and absolute power: Tsar Fyodor and Fyodor's younger brother, Prince Dmitry. Suddenly, and conveniently for Boris Godunov, word came that Prince Dmitry had died while under guard. Officials, handpicked by Godunov, determined that the 10-year-old prince had suffered an epileptic seizure while playing with a knife and accidentally killed himself. Though no real evidence connected Godunov to the possible murder, many suspected that he had done the deed. Not long after, Tsar Fyodor died at the age of 30 without producing an heir. Acting quickly, Boris Godunov gathered an assembly to elect him Tsar. However, not 1 year after he assumed the throne, the volcanic eruption in South America led to 3 brutal winters in Russia that led to 3 years of crop failure, one after the other. Already on the northern tier of European agriculture, Russian peasants had few reserves to ride out hungry months with. Boris Godunov, to his credit, made desperate attempts to collect and distribute food to hungry areas. Yet it did no good in large part because of how Boris had come to power. Many Russians blamed Godunov himself for bringing the famine to start with. After all, Godunov had committed a terrible sin in their eyes by seizing the throne from the sons of Ivan the Terrible, and Russians saw him as a usurper who had brought the anger of God upon Russia. Desperate peasants turned to eating hay and grass. People lay stiffened in the snow, frozen to death with their mouths still stuffed with hay. Some families were reduced to murdering and eating their own children if they could not find enough food to survive the winter. Other villages set up cannibal cafeterias where they served strangers they waylaid and murdered. Russian peasants justified the eating of human flesh by noting that the soul belonged to God, but the body belonged to men. Some sensational accounts even told of bakers selling pies cooked with human meat in the market stalls of Moscow. Indeed, the cannibal chefs would have had much to choose from. Around the wooden walls of the Russian capital, survivors threw 127,000 half-frozen corpses into ditches dug around the city walls. As Russians grew more and more desperate, armed mobs began sweeping through central Russia. Russian peasants saw wealth as intrinsically sinful, a sign of corrupt character earned by squeezing hard-working peasants. So they invaded the houses of Russian boyars, embarking on wholesale looting, hauling out wheels of cheese, grain reserves, and cured meats. When Boris Godunov sent the army to suppress them, the peasants did battle with imperial forces and sometimes won. Yet the looting could not feed men for long. Russia, a country of almost 6 million people, saw 1 to 2 million people starve during the next 3 years. Thus, when word came that Prince Dmitry still lived and called upon Russians to restore his birthright, they readily believed him, and many Russians hoped that by restoring Dmitry to the throne, they could end their suffering. The man known to history as the first false Dmitry emerged in Poland. Somehow he won over the Polish nobility and gained the support of the Jesuits. In exchange for their support, they extracted a promise from him to make Russia a Catholic country. In 1604, with a small band of Poles, Cossacks, and peasant refugees who fled the famine, the first false Dmitry invaded Russia. The people saw him as their deliverance, both from the usurper Godunov and from the famine. Swarms of hungry and angry migrants in the south turned out in the streets to cheer the first false Dmitry and littered his path with flowers. Boris Godunov arrived with an army to defend his throne. Yet in a moment that many Russians surely saw as a final expression of divine anger, Boris Godunov died before the final battle. The first false Dmitry entered Moscow in triumph, was crowned Tsar, and the remnants of the Godunov family went into a dungeon, where a guard quietly strangled them. However, the first false Dmitry soon alienated Russians by trying to impose Catholicism upon them, and this triggered another round of coup and counter-coup that led into a decade-long series of civil wars that ultimately caused the death of 5 million people from the Ural Mountains to the Baltic and even Sweden and Poland. The time of troubles in Russia demonstrates how the Little Ice Age ultimately became more than a human tragedy. It shaped many of the upheavals of the 17th century, like the English Civil War, the 30 Years' War, and the Fronde in France, in ways both obvious and subtle. With so many poor and desperate people willing to chance army life just to be fed, governments found it easier to start wars with rival states. Leaders found themselves desperate for resources to support both the state and their lavish lifestyles. They found it very easy to rally their subjects against a hated enemy who provided a convenient scapegoat for their problems. Indeed, as people faced terrifying and arbitrary losses, they turned to their faith, whether Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox, and began searching for scapegoats closer to home, most infamously the supposed witches, who were burned at the stake by the thousands, as people tried to find somebody to blame for their suffering. And that wraps things up for this Legendarium series. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.